Hi guys, hope you're having a good day today. Um, don't forget to take your Chapter 16 quiz today. We're going to be talking about Chapter 14, again, just a few pages in Chapter 14 today, 465 through 471, which I know you guys don't have a textbook, so that really doesn't mean anything to you. But anyway, just a few pages in Chapter 14, so we're just spending today on Chapter 14. You will have a quiz over Chapter 14 tomorrow, and we will begin Chapter 15. Remember, we will finish up Chapter 15 next week and have a quiz. And you guys, Chapter 15 is the last chapter that we'll be talking about this semester, so remember, pretty much after next week, the only thing you'll have left to do is your last lecture exam and then your final. So lecture exam 5 and then your final next week, and you'll be done. After we begin Chapter 15 on Wednesday, then you're going to have Thursday and Friday to do lab exercise 22. Again, next week we will finish up Chapter 15. We will do lab exercise 23, and we will also have our last lab exam, which, remember, our lab exam will be over just exercises 22 and 23. So we're going to go ahead and get started then for today. We are going to be talking about sensory receptors today. So it's not a lot of information, and it's definitely not really difficult. But just looking at all the different sensory receptors that you have in your body, there's some that you're familiar with, but some that you may not be familiar with. So when we talk about sensory receptors, we're talking about sensation. Remember that we have sensation, integration, and then a response, which is a motor response. Sensation, remember, is just the brain receiving the information from the body by way of sensory receptors. So we have sensory receptors, and believe it or not, most of the sensory receptors that you have in your body are mainly in your skin. We do have sensory receptors in our ears and our nose and our tongue and our eyes. And we also even have sensory receptors internally in our visceral organs that communicate with our brain about the condition of our internal organs so that we become aware when something is wrong. But most of our sensory receptors are in our skin. Our skin is capable of a lot of different sensations, not just touch, which, if we think about touch, there's different kinds of touch. We can have light touch, like tickling, barely moving your hair, you can feel the tickling. You can have heavy touch or pressure. But then we also have other sensations in our skin, like heat, cold, pain. So a lot of our sensory receptors are found in our skin. But anyway, once that sensory receptor is stimulated, then it sends information along your peripheral nerves to your brain and spinal cord. Again, remember, in your brain and spinal cord, interpretation happens. So this is where that sensation is interpreted as either something that you can ignore or something that you need to make a response to. If your brain decides that you need to make a response to it, then the brain will send that information about the response back down a motor neuron to the muscles in that organ or in that area of the body to make your response to whatever it is. So if you think about it, how do we respond to just about every sensation that we have? Generally, there's some kind of movement involved. Again, touching a hot pot, being cold, even when you hearing something loud, if nothing else, you turn your head and look. A bright flash of light, you close your eyes. Even internally, those responses involve heart muscle slowing down its contraction or speeding up its contraction, smooth muscle in the digestive tract speeding up or slowing down its contraction. So pretty much, all of our responses to the information that we take in with these sensory receptors involves, again, as we've already talked about in the last couple of chapters, somatic neurons, somatic motor neurons contracting our skeletal muscles, or autonomic motor neurons, that's going to be sympathetic or parasympathetic, or even those enteric motor neurons contracting our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands. So we've already talked about the different kinds of motor neurons and how, they are responsible for our responses. Now we're going to be looking at our sensations. How do we get the sensations that then travel to our brain to let our brain determine the correct motor response? So again, a sensation is when the brain receives information about your environment, or that can be your external or internal environment, and sends it to the brain. Again, it is initiated by stimuli from these receptor from either inside or outside the body, acting on the sensory receptors. Again, we have sensory receptors in our organs as well as in our skin and all of our sense organs. Perception is when we become consciously aware of those sensations. So again, that's when that integration happens. That is when that stimuli, that information from that stimulus, travels along a sensory neuron to our brain, and our brain becomes aware. Our brain interprets it. Specifically, it's going to be your cerebrum that is interpreting these the external stimuli for sure. Our senses are the means by which our brain receives information about our environment, either internal or external. And that's why I have body here, because body is internal and then external environment. There are two types of senses. We have our general senses and then we have special senses. Our general senses are somatic and visceral, and they are a lot what they sound like. And then our special senses are 4 of our 5, what we call our 5 senses. So our smell, our taste, our sight, our hearing, and our balance. And these two kind of go together, and we'll see that more in Chapter 15. Our hearing and our balance go together. So those 5 are considered special senses. So what's the difference between general senses and special senses? As you can see here, our general senses are going to be involving touch, and then our special senses are smell, taste, sight, hearing, and balance, which go together. So what's the difference between the two? Well, our general senses are distributed over a large part of your body. Again, most of these receptors are going to be in your skin or else in your visceral organs. When these receptors generate an action potential, that action potential is called a generator potential. So it's an action. The action potentials in these senses are called generator potentials, and those generator potentials are sent to the brain. So there are 2 types of general senses, somatic and visceral. Again, as I said earlier, they are exactly what they sound like. The somatic sense provides information about our body and our environment. And the sensory receptors for these are located in our skin, muscles, and joints. And these sensory receptors that are responsible for our somatic sense are touch, pressure, temperature, proprioception, and pain. So that these are the things they respond to. Again, if you look at this is pretty much touch. This is feeling, your sense of feeling, I guess you could say. Feeling touch, feeling pressure, feeling hot and cold, feeling pain, and then proprioception. We've talked about proprioception a little bit before, but again, proprioception is our ability to have a sense of our body's position and movement, such as your ability, even when your eyes are closed, you're able to touch your nose because of this sense of proprioception. You are able to, even with your eyes closed and you're not looking, you know that your hand is right here beside your face, or you know that your finger is moving towards your nose and you can touch the tip end of your nose. So you have a sense of proprioception. So basically, all of the things that we can feel are our somatic general sense. And again, we have these sensory receptors for this sense located in our skin, muscle, and joints. Our visceral general sense is also feeling. The difference is, instead of providing information about our body and environment, it's providing information about our internal organs. And the sensory receptors for this sense are located in our internal organs. And the main 2 things that we're going to be able to feel as a result of the sensory receptors for this sense are going to be pain and pressure. So again, in your body, the organs inside your body, you don't feel cold or hot. You don't feel touch. You mainly feel pressure and pain. That's what you feel. When there's something going on inside your body with your organs, you're going to feel pain. Now, it can be a dull pain. It can be a shooting pain. It can be a sharp pain. You can have different types of pain, but you feel pain when you have something going on. And you can also feel pressure, such as the pressure when it's time to go use the bathroom, to urinate or to defecate. The pressure from the contractions of having a baby, pressure and pain is what you end up having with that. So again, from these internal organs, the main 2 things we're going to feel are pressure and pain. So these 2 senses together, the somatic and visceral senses, are our general senses. And overall, to me, these encompass our sense of touch, our sense of feeling, all the different things we can feeling. And then all of our other senses are called special senses. Why are they called special senses? Because they're located in special sense organs, okay? So these receptors are located mostly in our skin, some in our joints and muscles, and then of course in our internal organs. So this is a more general sense over most of the body. Whereas our special senses are localized. They are localized to these special sense organs. So they're not distributed all over the body. They're located in these special sense organs. And if you think about it, all of these special sense organs are on our head, very close to our brain. You know, our ears for hearing, our tongue for taste, our nose for smelling, our eyes for sight, and also our ears for balance. So all of these special senses, their sensory receptors are located in those special sense organs that are pretty much right there on your head, very close to your brain. And when these sensory receptors produce an action potential, it's called a receptor potential. Remember, the sensory receptors of our general senses produce an action potential called a generator potential that travels to the brain, whereas our sensory receptors for our special senses produce a receptor potential. And this receptor potential results in the release of a neurotransmitter that stimulates a neuron and generates an action potential, which then travels to the brain. So a little bit different way that this information gets to our brain. With our general senses, the generator potential is an action potential that travels to our brain. Okay, but with our special senses, what we get is a receptor potential, and this receptor potential is not an action potential, it's a local potential that if it is strong enough, it will result in the release of a neurotransmitter. And this neurotransmitter will then result in an action potential in an actual sensory neuron, okay? So again, if you're a visual person, this will help you to kind of put it all in order. Again, we have two senses, our general senses and our special senses. Of the general senses, we have two. We have somatic and visceral. Our somatic general sense involves touch, pressure, proprioception, temperature, and pain. Our visceral general sense involves pain and pressure. And again, remember, this is located in our internal organs. This is located in skin, muscles, and joints. Remember that our special senses, the receptors are located in specific sense organs, and there are 5 special senses: smell, taste, sight, hearing, and balance. So again, that is a good visual for those different senses that we have. So now we're going to look at classifying all these sensory receptors again. Lots of different kinds of sensory receptors. We're going to first look at the types of receptors based upon the type of stimulus that they can detect. We're going to look at them at them based upon their location in your body, and then finally based upon the structure of the receptor. So there are 5 types of stimulus, five types of sensory receptors based upon the stimulus that they can detect. The first one is a mechanoreceptor, and you guys, to me, these are pretty easy because you can tell by the prefix here as to what these receptors are responding to. Again, we're looking at the stimulus that is detected. So mechanoreceptors, the stimulus that they detect is mechanical force. They respond to mechanical stimuli such as compression, stretching, bending, force. Okay, they respond to some type of mechanical stimulus, some type of movement or force. And again, our senses of touch, pressure, proprioception, hearing, and balance are mechanoreceptors. So we will see when we talk about the sense of hearing and balance that the receptor cells are going to vibrate. They're going to move. They're going to be, the cells will be bent. And that is what will cause the receptor potential to be generated, or the generator potential. If you remember our muscle spindles, those are sensory receptors in our muscles that respond to stretch. Okay, our Golgi tendon organs in our tendons are sensory receptors that respond to stretch. So all of those things would be considered mechanoreceptors. We're going to be talking about Merkel cells and Ruffini end organs, and we're going to be talking about Pacinian corpuscles, and those respond to compression. They respond to heavy touch, light touch. So again, those are all going to be mechanoreceptors. Chemoreceptors respond to chemicals, so they respond to chemical stimuli. The main two senses that are responsible, that are chemoreceptors, or that use chemoreceptors, are going to be our senses of smell and taste. Smell molecules from a chemical attached to those chemoreceptors in your nose and cause that receptor potential to be generated. Molecules, chemicals in the food that you eat, those molecules bind to the chemoreceptors in your taste buds and generate that receptor potential. Thermoreceptors, again, thermo means temperature, so these respond to changes in temperature. So we will be talking about some sensory receptors that are in our skin that respond to cold and respond to heat, and we even have some thermoreceptors in our skin that cause pain, that respond to very cold and very hot temperatures. Photoreceptors. Photo means light. These receptors respond to light striking the receptor cells, and obviously this is going to be your sense of vision. We're going to talk about those bipolar neurons. We're going to talk about the sensory receptors. You actually have rods and cones that are bipolar neurons that generate, when light hits them, it generates that receptor potential. And then we'll be talking about nociceptors, which are pain receptors. And again, so those receptors that I talked about that respond to extreme hot and extreme cold are not thermoreceptors. They are actually nociceptors. They respond to extreme temperatures. Nociceptors can also respond to extreme mechanical stresses. So again, extreme mechanical stresses, you're not going to be activating mechanoreceptors. You're going to be activating nociceptors, causing pain. And then extreme chemicals like very strong acids and bases are not going to activate chemoreceptors. They're going to activate these nociceptors, these pain receptors, and cause pain. Okay, so 3 types of sensory receptors based upon location are going to be cutaneous, viscero, and proprioceptors. And again, you can tell by the name where they are. Again, based upon location here, so we're looking at where are they. Cutaneous receptors are in our skin. So cutaneous, remember our cutaneous membrane is our skin. So cutaneous receptors are located in our skin, and they give us information about our external environment. So, the world around us. Visceroreceptors are receptors that are located in our visceral organs, our internal organs, your heart, your lungs, your digestive organs, your liver, your gallbladder, all those things. And they provide our brain information about our internal environment inside of our body. And then proprioceptors, again, proprioception is your ability to know the position and movement of your body even without looking. So these are going to be located in organs that are associated with the position and movement of your body. So joints and tendons and connective tissues. So things like our muscle spindle, our Golgi tendon organ, those are going to be proprioceptors. And again, they provide information to our brain about the position of our body, the movement of our body, and they're also able to detect stretch and force. Okay? And then there are 8 types of sensory receptors based upon their structure. Again, these are very specific in the types of stimuli that they will respond to. So some of these, when we talk about what they will respond to, they will respond to that stimulus based upon their structure. We have lots of different ones. We will be talking about free nerve endings. We'll be talking about Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles, Merkel disc, Ruffini end organs. I don't know if we're going to be talking about the Krauss end bulb or not. It's another one, but I don't think we're talking about it. So lots of different, or 8 here that we're going to be talking about that respond to specific stimuli based upon their structure. Again, this one is showing many of them. Notice the location. The Meissner's corpuscles are going to be in those basal layers or the deepest layers of your epidermis, but still they're pretty close to the surface, so they're going to be responsible for lighter touch sensations. Pacinian corpuscles are located much deeper down in the middle to bottom of the dermis, and so they're going to be able to detect much deeper or heavier touch. Merkel end organs are also going to be, or Merkel discs are also going to be able to detect light, pressure, and touch. We have receptors associated with our hair follicles that allow us to feel our hair being moved. These are what are associated with the whiskers on a cat or a mouse that allow just when they allow those whiskers, they allow your hair to participate in the touch sensation, so that just anything can barely touch one of those little whiskers, and that mouse knows there's something right there and they'll run away from it. So again, it makes the hair and the whiskers and things on animals very sensitive to touch. Okay, so looking at these individually, free nerve endings are going to be the simplest, most unspecialized of the 8 types of sensory receptors based upon structure. They're going to be the ones that are the least specialized, and they are the most common. They are scattered throughout most of your body, especially in your connective tissues and your epithelial tissues, such as your skin. Again, that's a big place where you're going to find these. They are going to allow you to feel pain and temperature, as well as itch and movement. And when we look at the receptors that are responsible for temperature detection, and this is what I was talking about earlier, cold receptors, this is going to be a thermoreceptor. But this is how you're able to detect cool, okay? This is what allows you to respond to menthol, like when you chew that minty gum or you put the Vicks Vapor Rub on your skin. These thermoreceptors, these cold receptors, allow you to feel the cool. When a fan blows on you, when you stick your hand in the refrigerator or the freezer, they allow you to feel the coolness. And there are about 10 to 15 times more cold receptors than there are warm receptors. Warm receptors allow you to feel warmth. And as your skin temperature increases, the rate of action potentials will increase, which will cause you to feel warm. And with the cold, as your skin is cooled, the rate of action potentials increases the more the skin is cooled. But if you are exposed to extreme cold, which will be 12 degrees and below Celsius, or extreme heat, which is above 47 degrees Celsius, then you won't be stimulating these cold and warm receptors. You won't be stimulating these thermoreceptors. You'll be stimulating pain receptors. Remember, these are nociceptors. Whenever you got extreme cold or extreme heat, it does not stimulate those thermoreceptors, the warm and cold receptors. It stimulates the nociceptors, the pain receptors only. Okay, another one of our sensory receptors that we're looking at are Merkel discs or tactile discs. These have the ends of these cells have branches that end as flattened expansions that are associated with specialized epithelial cells. So again, you're going to find these in the upper layers of your skin, specifically in the basal layers of the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis is the upper layer of the skin, and in the basal, the deeper layers of that epidermis. So again, they're pretty close to the surface of your skin. They are associated with deep dome-shaped mounds of thickened epidermis and hairy skin. So again, these are going to be found in areas of your body in your skin that has hair, and they allow you, because they are closer to the surface, allow you to sense light touch and superficial pressure. So like when you're you feel your clothes on your body, someone touches your shoulder, something like that. Okay, hair follicle receptors, also called hair end organs or root hair plexus. This is the one that we were looking at earlier that's associated with your hair follicles. They are able to let you feel a very slight bending of your hair, a very slight movement, as I was talking about, like with the mouse whiskers. Just anything touch that whisker, even very slightly, they're able to sense that and run away. So again, these are very sensitive. They're not very localized. Like you're not necessarily sure exactly which hair was touched, but they're very sensitive, meaning you know that a hair was touched and you know the general location where it was. Again, another name for this is a root hair plexus. Again, this is what allows those whiskers of animals to be so sensitive and allow them to get away from danger. Then we have our Pacinian corpuscles, also called lamellated, because they kind of look like the layers of an onion. Again, these are going to be found deeper in the skin, in the deep dermis or hypodermis, and they help you to feel deep pressure or touch. So heavy pressure, heavy touch. These also can be involved with proprioception if they are associated with joints. So again, allowing us to be able to know about our body's position and movement if they're associated with joints. Then we have our Meissner's corpuscles or tactile corpuscles. These also are going to be in the very superficial layers of the skin. These are going to be found in your dermal papilla, which are going to be, remember, those folds. So they're going to be mainly on your hands and your feet, associated with the folds that give you your fingerprints and your handprints and your toe prints and your footprints. And they are able, again, to sense very light touch because they are pretty superficial in your skin. But the thing that they're most noted for is two-point discrimination. Well, what is two-point discrimination? It is your ability to detect simultaneous stimulation at 2 points on your skin. So basically, you can, if you closed your eyes and someone took their forefinger and their middle finger and they touched your skin, let's say on your arm, if you would be able to tell if that is one touch or two touch. Basically, you know, the further away the 2 points are that are touching, if you get them far enough apart, you can tell it's two different touches. But the closer you get together, that those two touches feel just like one touch. Even though it's two things touching your skin, it feels like one. So these cells are what are able to allow you to distinguish whether two things are touching you or one thing is touching you. Again, on your fingertips and your tongue, you know, even on your arm, these are more numerous. So you can tell that there's two things touching you even if they're closer together. But they're less numerous on places like maybe your neck and your back. So that, you know, the closer something gets together, you can't distinguish whether it's one touch or two touch, whether it's one thing or two things touching you. Well, who really cares? Well, you guys, these are the things that allow us to detect the texture of objects. So when you're able to rub your fingers across something and feel the texture of it, it's because, you know, it has little bumps and things, so you're able to distinguish that there's more than one thing touching your finger at a time. And that's what allows you to distinguish the texture. So it's these Meissner's corpuscles that allow you to do that two-point discrimination and to feel the texture of objects. Okay, we have our Ruffini end organ. These are primarily found in the dermis in your fingers, and they respond to continuous touch or pressure. So this is going to be like somebody's got their hand on your shoulder or something. Or maybe even, you know, the clothes on your body. You're able to feel, when you first put your clothes on, you're able to feel that your clothes are continuously touching your skin. But then, after we've had them on for just a little bit, we don't notice them anymore, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, muscle spindles we've already talked about. Remember that they consist of 3 to 10 specialized skeletal muscle cells. This is going to be it right here. So they're specialized skeletal muscle cells. You can still see the striations there. And they provide information to your brain and spinal cord about the length of your muscles. And remember, they are involved in the stretch reflex. These, if they become too stretched, then they will stimulate the flexor muscles to flex that joint to shorten that muscle because it's being stretched too far, like when you're holding a heavy weight and you drop it. They are also important in controlling our postural muscles and in the tone of our postural muscles, so muscles that help us to maintain our posture. And then the last one we're going to look at is the Golgi tendon organ, and we've also already talked about this. Remember that it is involved in that, what was the name of that? You'll have to go back and look because I can't remember the name of the reflex right now, but it was also involved in one of those reflexes that we talked about. And this Golgi tendon organ is a proprioceptor that is associated with your tendons. If your tendons have too much tension on them, then, and this might be the one where if you drop, yeah, the stretch reflex was if you, like when the doctor hits your knee with the hammer, the patellar reflex. This reflex was the one that if you're holding a heavy weight and you drop it, it responds to increased tension on a tendon, and stops that muscle contraction. Basically, it stops the muscle from contracting so that it relaxes and it doesn't stretch too far. Okay, So, and again, if you want more, I know I got a little bit mixed up with those because it's been a while since we talked about those. So if you want more information about those two sensory receptors, then please go back and look at our chapter where we talked about those, which I think it was probably like chapter, it was the one on the spinal cord, I think. Okay. So, responses of sensory receptors. Once a sensory receptor has been stimulated, a graded potential will be generated. Again, this is a local change, and this is generally called a receptor potential. Remember, it is called a generator potential if we're talking about those general senses, but in our special senses, it's called a receptor potential. So anyway, the primary receptors are sensory receptors that conduct action potentials in response to receptor potential. So most of our sensory receptors are in this category. Again, these are going to be those general sense, the receptors involved in our general senses. They are the ones that, okay, an action potential. We get an action potential and it gets taken to a sensory neuron. There you go. But our secondary receptors, these are going to be our special sense organs, our special senses. When we get a local potential, we get a release of neurotransmitter that will then attach to a sensory neuron and generate an action potential in that sensory neuron. So the receptor cells of our special senses, our smell, our taste, our hearing, and our balance are all going to be secondary receptors because they release, and even our vision too, they are going to release neurotransmitters that are going to attach to a sensory neuron and generate an action potential in that sensory neuron. So the primary receptors do not release neurotransmitters. They produce and conduct action potentials themselves. The secondary receptors do not produce and conduct action potentials themselves. They produce receptor potentials that then cause neurotransmitters to be released and generate an action potential in a sensory neuron. Okay, so here we have a demonstration of the difference. A mechanoreceptor, such as a Pacinian corpuscle, is subjected to deep pressure. It generates a graded potential. When this graded potential reaches threshold, it conducts an action potential. And this action potential will be propagated toward the CNS. So notice that this sensory receptor itself is a sensory neuron, and it conducts an action potential toward another sensory neuron to be taken toward the central nervous system, towards your brain and spinal cord. But a chemoreceptor, which is for taste, when it is subjected to its stimulus, it releases, notice how it is not notice this Pacinian corpuscle is actually a sensory neuron, okay? Notice this is not a sensory neuron. This is a special receptor. When it is exposed to its chemical stimulus, in this case, this is a chemoreceptor, then it generates a receptor potential that causes it to release a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter binds to the sensory neuron, which generates an action potential if it reaches threshold, and that then is carried toward the CNS by that sensory neuron. So again, you can see the difference here. The Pacinian corpuscle itself conducts the action potential. It does not cause the release of a neurotransmitter to generate an action potential. It itself generates and conducts that action potential. But with the secondary receptor, the stimulus causes it to release a neurotransmitter that then attaches to the sensory neuron and generates an action potential in the sensory neuron. So the sensory receptor itself is not conducting an action potential. A receptor potential is generated that then becomes an action potential when this neurotransmitter is released and stimulates this sensory neuron. Okay, a couple of different responses we want to look at. Adaptation, I was talking about this a second ago. It is decreased sensitivity to a continued stimulus. Another name for it, or an example of it, is when you become nose blind. Okay, you've heard of nose blind on the Febreze commercials. Another name for this is olfactory fatigue. Basically, once you have been exposed to a stimulus for a period of time, you don't notice that stimulus anymore. You adapt to it. So, for example, if you're around someone, and I know this may be a bad example, but maybe you're around someone who has body odor, and you're like, how do they not know they smell? Okay, this is why they don't know, because of adaptation. They have been around that so much, they don't notice that they have body odor. People who are not around them, who are not around that odor a lot, come up to them, can smell the odor, but they themselves don't know, because they have become nose blind to that. They have become adapted to that, and so they don't notice that odor. If you've ever walked into someone's house and you tell them, oh, your house smells so good, well, they don't notice that. They don't notice how their house smells because they're around it all the time. And so they have become nose blind to that. Whereas someone who's not normally around that odor walks into their house and they're like, oh, this smells so good. What do you use? Oh, well, I don't know what I use. I just clean my house or something. You know what I'm saying? Like my sister, her house has this odor. She doesn't notice it. It's a good odor. It smells good. She doesn't notice that her house smells good. But every time I go in there, I'm like, oh, your house just smells so good. What do you use? Well, I use these little plugins, you know. She tells me what plugins she uses. Even if I use those plugins in my house wouldn't smell like that. My house is a lot older than hers. And so I could never get that really good smell in my house like she has in hers. But in any case, she doesn't notice that odor because she's around that odor all the time. Even when she comes to my house or to my mom's house, you can smell the odor of her house on her and her kids. It's just whenever I smell that odor, I think of my sister because that's what her house smells like. But again, she doesn't notice it because she has become adapted to that. Another example, when you put your clothes on, when you first put them on, you notice them. You notice that touch, that light touch or pressure on your body, on your skin. But after you've had them on a little while, you don't notice that anymore because of adaptation. Those sensory receptors in your skin become accustomed to that light pressure or touch, and so you don't notice it. Another response of sensory receptors is proprioceptors. They tell us, they provide information to our brain and spinal cord about the precise position and rate of movement of various body parts. We have two different types of proprioceptors, tonic receptors and phasic receptors. Tonic receptors adapt very slowly. So these are going to be examples of this would be like your Merkel discs and your Ruffini end organs. So again, it takes them longer to become accustomed to, or to become adapted, to become accustomed to this pressure or touch. Whereas phasic receptors adapt very rapidly and so are most sensitive to changes in stimuli. So for example, like we said, the Pacinian and the Meissner's corpuscles. The Pacinian corpuscles are going to be, and this is for deep pressure and touch, so heavy pressure, the Pacinian corpuscles. So if you have something that's really pushing on you, these adapt very rapidly, so you kind of get used to that very rapidly. So then if you notice it's not so then as soon as it's not pushing on you anymore, you're going to notice that really quickly. Whereas the tonic receptors, they adapt more slowly, so you're going to notice the touch of these Merkel discs for longer. And then once you become adapted to it, even if you move that touch away, it's going to take you longer to recognize that touch has been moved away because these adapt more slowly. Because these adapt more rapidly, you're more sensitive to changes in stimuli that have been stimulating these Pacinian corpuscles, for example. Okay, so that will be all for today. Not too bad. Please let me know if you have any questions. Tomorrow you will have a quiz over this information, and then we will start Chapter 15 on Wednesday. Or we will also start Chapter 15 tomorrow after you take your Chapter 14 quiz. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.